The first reading this morning from the Bible is from the Old Testament, the book of Job, chapter 1, verses 13 through 21. As I read this passage the first time this week, I couldn't help but reflect on what happened last Sunday morning in Orlando and what happened to that little boy at Disney World. See if you agree. One day, when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabines fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels, and carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed is his name of the Lord." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
I can think of at least 4 life-changing moments that have occurred in my life. Those moments that have turned my world upside down, particularly the way I've looked at the world. And through these 4 different moments, I was able to see the world in a whole new way. Now, these aren't in any particular order. One was the summer of 1982, and although I had been raised in the church as the youngest of 4 boys, it was that summer that my mother looked at me and said, "You need to go to church camp." Church camp, reform school, I chose church camp. I had just finished the 7th grade and attended Jamonville United Methodist Camp in western Pennsylvania, and it was there that I accepted Christ for the first time, and my outlook on the world began to change. Another life-changing moment was August 22nd, 1992, the day that I got married. And almost 24 years later, I have a better appreciation for what I was getting into. My wife also has a much better appreciation for what she was getting herself into. Then there was May 21st, 2000, the year my daughter was born. For those of you fathers who were able to be present in the delivery room at the time, you would understand that there are just some things I cannot unsee. But now I have a second person depending on me, another lifelong commitment. But one of the most profound experiences, I think, occurred in the fall of 1991. That was when my second oldest brother, he's 6 years older than I am, came out of the closet to me and my family. That one really threw me. I mean, up until that point, I didn't know any gay people. Okay, that's probably not true. I just didn't know they were gay at the time. But it threw me because for a while, I didn't know who he was. It was like he was leading this secret life away from the rest of us. He was afraid to tell his own family. He was afraid to let us know who he really was, afraid that we wouldn't accept him. And I have to tell you, this challenged me. It challenged my theology at the time. It challenged everything I had learned in college. It called into question everything that I thought I knew. I struggled to understand why in the world would he choose to be like this, and how could he do this to our family? And as I wrestled with this for probably 6 or 7 or 8 months, I came to some conclusions that I thought were profound, at least for me. I came to the conclusion that he didn't choose to be this way, that this was how he was born, this was who he was, who he has always been. And I thought to myself, choosing to be gay in the 1980s and 1990s is very different than it is today. I equate it to choosing to be African American in the midst of segregation and Jim Crow. It's not a harassment that you would choose to put yourself through. But I also came to the conclusion, most importantly, that he's my brother, that he's family, and that I love him. I share this because, as Joe stated, my heart aches for what happened in Orlando last Sunday morning. My heart aches for the 49 deaths and 53 injuries as a result of a shooting rampage at a gay nightclub in Orlando. My heart aches that people were targeted just because they were gay and decided to go out for an evening. My heart aches over the hatred I have seen spewed over the internet this past week. One particular a Baptist pastor, said last Sunday during his worship service that Orlando was safer because 49 homosexuals were killed. He said that he wished more were killed and that they deserved to die. Now, no matter where you stand on the issue of homosexuality, and I know not everyone is of the same mind or agreement, I believe this type of hate speech cannot be tolerated. I grieve for the gunman and his loss of life and what his family now has to go through. But as a Christian and a pastor, I do not want to be associated with the rhetoric that some people are spewing at this point in time. I want to stand with the LGBT community because Romans 12:15 tells me that we should weep with those who are weeping. I choose to stand with the LGBT community because this week I thought to myself, this could have been my brother. Who's a husband and a father. He's an uncle. He's a child of God. This could have been him. But my heart also aches because I know that during times of tragedy, people begin to question God and God's goodness and God's mercy. People begin to question their faith. People cry out that life is unfair. And I completely agree. God can be questioned. It's seen throughout scriptures and throughout our history. Our faith can be stretched. And yes, life is unfair. Tell me, who said it was going to be? So that brings us to our new sermon series on the book of Job, When Life is Unfair. If you're not familiar with this particular story, let me give you a brief synopsis. Job was a very wealthy man who lived in the land of Uz. He had a large family with extensive flocks. He was blameless and upright and was always careful to avoid doing evil. And in the course of one day, Job receives 4 messages, each bearing separate news of devastation. his livestock, his servants, his 10 children have all died due to marauding invaders or natural disasters. But instead of questioning, Job did what was customary at that time during mourning. He tore his clothes, he shaved his head, but he still blessed God in his prayers. Talk about life being unfair. I mean, how could all of this happen to Job in one day? Now, before I talk about the how, I think we need to understand a little bit about the book and a little bit about its history. First of all, no one is really quite sure when Job was written. No one's quite sure who wrote Job. And as they look at the style of the book, they discover some very interesting things. It contains sections of prose, it contains sections of wisdom, it contains section of poetry. And many scholars believe that Job is an example of an Old Testament parable. What does that mean? Well, I think we're more familiar with parables in the New Testament. Jesus used them all the time when he was trying to explain difficult teachings in a way that people could understand. He would take complex ideas and he would put them into story form that people could relate to. Jesus used the parable of the prodigal son to explain how God still loves us even when we go astray. He used the parable of the sower, of how we're to go out and share the gospel. He talks about the parable of the man who built his house on solid rock, telling us about our foundation of faith. Now, just because something is a parable doesn't mean it isn't important or it isn't biblical. As we look through the Bible this year, one of the things we discovered is that the Bible is not just one book, but it is 66 different books that are put together with different types of genre, different types of literature. The Bible is books of history and poetry and wisdom and prophets. And this particular story, this particular parable, the story of Job, tries to explain a very difficult concept. How do you explain how one particular person could maintain their faith in God in spite of their tragic circumstances? Let me show you the book of Job. Now, another important piece for us to understand as we begin this sermon series are the main characters in the book, particularly from the beginning of the story, the part that we didn't read. We read in Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 12, and of course I'll be reading in the English. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on earth and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There was no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? Have you blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land? But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your very face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, all that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now, I say that I use the English translation very purposefully, because this reading, this word Satan, is not the Satan as we understand the concept. The concept of Satan, the concept of the devil, is actually a concept that doesn't begin to appear until the New Testament period. So if we were to read this in the original language of Hebrew, the word for Satan used here is ha-Satan, which translated means the accuser or the adversary. And when we look a little deeper, we discover that the Ha-Satan is actually an angel in God's divine court who is a subordinate of God. This angel's whole responsibility is to defend God's honor. And how does this angel defend God's honor? By exposing those who pose a threat to God's holiness. And so this angel isn't God's adversary. It's the adversary of sinful and corrupt human beings. And so when God says to the Satan, "Where have you been?" the response is, "I was going to and fro looking for people who are dishonoring your holiness." And then they get into the conversation, well, what about one who is holy? How would they respond to you if everything was taken away? And so the story of Job tries to explain to those people who can understand why evil people receive punishment, but can't understand why people who are innocent undergo tragedy. I mean, we ask the same questions. I mean, we can understand why some people get what they deserve, why people reap what they sow, but we still have a difficult time trying to wrap our minds around and trying to make sense of why innocent people suffer when unspeakable tragedy strikes. You see, Job's story is our story. Now, most of us here today are pretty good people. Yes, would you admit to that? You're pretty good. You're not perfect. I'm not perfect. I think we're a pretty decent group of people. However, most of us here today have either faced challenges, are currently facing a challenge, or will someday, maybe in the not-so-distant future, face a serious challenge. I see this all the time in my job. I mean, I don't have to divulge any confidences, but over 25 years of ministry, I've seen a lot of people battling with serious health concerns. I deal with families who are dealing with death. I talk with people who are going through divorce. I work with people who are facing financial ruin. I deal with people every single day who ask the question, why? And I got to tell you, one of the hardest answers I have to give as a pastor is, I don't know. And although every situation is unique, I think all of the situations we face have two things in common. First, the people that are facing challenges for the most part are good people. They're not perfect, but they're still good people. And secondly, bad things happen to them. And although I wish it weren't true, bad things happen to very good people. And this is what Job's story is all about. So over the next few weeks, as we explore highlights from the book of Job, we're going to address some significant questions like, why do bad things happen to good people? How do you maintain faith in the midst of tragedy? How do you help friends and family members who are suffering? And how do you recover from overwhelming losses? Now, since I had to take the opportunity to set up the series and kind of give some background into this book, I just want to answer or look at or explore one question. When bad things happen to good people, what does God have to offer? And I choose my words very carefully. I don't say, why do bad things happen? I say, when. Because I don't always know why, but I do know that at some point or another, all of us are going to face a challenge at some point. So it's not a matter of why, it's a matter of when will it happen. And as we learn from Job, God doesn't protect us from suffering. God didn't protect Job from suffering. God doesn't protect us from suffering. I mean, we looked at that last week when we were studying the Lord's Prayer and the very last petition, which says, "Deliver us from evil." We aren't protected from it, but God still delivers us. We're not immune from pain. I mean, at the very center of the gospel, at the very core of our message, is a cross. Jesus, the crucified God, suffered. He experienced pain just as we do, and so we too will suffer. We will feel pain from time to time. And although God doesn't protect us from bad things, God offers us something very important when we're going through suffering or difficulties or challenges. God comes alongside us and gives us the strength to cope. God did this for Job, and God promises to do the same thing for us. Regardless of what happens, God will give us the strength to cope and the grace to endure. One of my favorite authors, Rabbi Harold Kushner, learned this truth firsthand, and he wrote a book back in 1987 entitled "When Bad Things Happen to Good People." He wrote this book as a response to an illness and eventual death of his son Aaron. When Aaron was just a little boy, he was diagnosed with an extremely rare disease called progeria, which means rapid aging. Aaron never grew beyond 3 feet tall. He had no hair on his head or on his body, and he looked like a little old man, even while he was still a child. Worse than that, he died while a teenager. It was an agonizing experience for the entire family, and Kushner doesn't sugarcoat it. He was brutally honest in his book about the anger and the frustration and the grief and the depression that he and his wife went through. How could he, a man of God, suffer in such a way? But even in the midst of his suffering, Rabbi Kushner learned that God gives his children the strength to cope with whatever life brings. And for the Kushner family, the strength came in 2 forms. Maybe you've experienced this as well. First, it came in the form of people. God, in God's grace, summoned friends to ease the Kushners' burden. They were sustained in Aaron's illness by people who cared for them. Rabbi Kushner said that it was this kind of caring was God's way of telling his family that they were not alone, that they hadn't been cast off. Rabbi Kushner also experienced the strength to cope directly from God. He speaks again and again of God's gift of courage and strength and hope. He writes, when he used up all his own strength, when he was weak, tired, angry, overwhelmed, when he reached the limits of his own strength and courage, he found reinforcement from a source outside himself. When he desperately felt alone, he found out he wasn't alone after all. God and other people were there for them, and through that he found the resiliency to go on living. God enabled him to live a meaningful and at times a joy-filled life in spite of the death of his son and in spite of living in a less than perfect world. And I think the closing line of Rabbi Kushner's book is a good reminder for all of us. When we're faced with tragedy and challenge, when we're in need of God's strength and grace to cope, he writes, yesterday seems less painful, and I am not afraid of tomorrow. Let us pray. But realize this, life's unfair. I'd love to say deal with it, but it's hard. So just know that when life is unfair, you have a God who is alongside you, and you have people who love you. So if you know someone who is going through difficulty, be that person who loves them. Or if you are that person, know that we are here. So go forth from this place with the grace and love of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Go forth in peace and in joy. Amen.